Welcome to the Dashboard Effect podcast. I'm Brick Thompson.
I'm Caleb Oakes.
Hey, Caleb. Last week we continued our discussion about all the stuff that Microsoft is doing and what we saw at the Build conference out in Seattle. Specifically, we talked about Copilots on top of Power BI. I thought this week it might be interesting to talk about what Fabric, the new Microsoft data stack branding and package, what that means in terms of, do you still need to have all these ancillary tools? Do you still need to have your Talons and your Databricks and your – I mean, we've got a picture somewhere that must have 70 of these things on them, and we've seen proposals from companies that have, sort of 8 tools that you need to run your data warehouse.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I think that this is honestly something that just bugs me personally. Like, of how many – I mean, if you haven't seen it, you Google it. Like, Google the modern data stack or modern data tools or something, and just look at the images. Like, there are so many tools out there. It's unfreaking believable.
Yeah.
And some of them are open source, some of them are not. Almost all of them you've got to pay for, I guess, except for a true open source. But there's some a lot of the software that you see now is like they'll have an open source version, but then they also have paid versions. That's like better features and stuff. So, but it's just like so many. You could literally pick a different tool for every single layer of an ETL pipeline or a data pipeline, and if you wanted, and it just gets unbelievable, and it's so crazy, and the marketing of these things is really, really good.
Yeah.
And
some of the tools are really good, actually.
Some of the tools are good, yeah.
It's not to say bad things about the tools, but you're having to cobble together a lot of stuff.
Right, and that opens up a whole host of other challenges. But what I think about this Fabric thing, and it's really what Microsoft had been trying to do with Azure Synapse for a long time, or at least for the past couple of years, is going to consolidate that stuff. And the Synapse workspace and Synapse Analytics does a pretty good job of it.
Yeah.
It does. It's still, I think in general, it's still a little bit more advanced in order to gain widespread adoption. But I think it did a pretty good job of it, and still is doing a really good job of consolidating some of those things. Now, not to say like something like Talend or some other sort of like data quality tool or something like that still might be useful in certain cases, but getting rid of so many different tools that this tool just allows you to query the data. You don't need those things. Like, you can keep those in a single stack of stuff, and Fabric makes that really easy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of attractiveness to that. I think some people will feel like, I don't want to be locked in then to this. Microsoft's going to own me at that point. And in fact, there is some truth to that. I mean, if you buy into that ecosystem, it's going to be painful if you want to move somewhere else. Like, you want to move to, I don't know, Snowflake has this Iceberg Parquet file data lake thing. Maybe there will be tools to make that happen, but you're going to have to do a lot of work probably. Yeah,
I guess that's one of the advantages, right, of having a bunch of different tools. I don't think this advantage outweighs the disadvantages of it, but it's a little bit more modular, right? So if you have a tool for doing your data movement and something better comes out, then you can maybe just replace that one piece,
right? A
little bit easier, but I guess you could make an argument you could do that if you're on the Microsoft stack too, but.
That's true. Yeah, anyway, nothing would keep you from doing that, except there are probably some key central pieces that you just can't do that. You're not going to replace one lake. Well, actually, that's not true. You could go to AWS and then point to the AWS data from one lake.
You could. Right. Yeah, and I always say at the end of the day, it's tables and it's rows and it's JSON files. It's just data, right?
Yeah.
And it's just the tool that you're putting on top of it to work with that data. It really doesn't matter, quite frankly, what tool it is. What really does matter is how you use the tool, and you're applying best practices to your data, and you're building stuff that's going to be scalable and stable and robust and get the business the insights that they need in a good way.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that definitely applies to the infrastructure layer, so your data pipelines, your storage, your modeling, and it goes beyond that. But if you have some kind of analysis tool that you really like, instead of maybe Azure machine learning or something that you want to do predictions with, fine, you can connect those up to this infrastructure and use it. So I'm not actually. I'm sort of thinking that maybe I wasn't right. It's not so much lock-in. I mean, it is a bit if you want to move where your data sits.
Yeah, right.
There's some advantages, though. I mean, you've got some cost advantages for sure. You've got support advantages. You've got the advantage that Microsoft is going to hopefully make sure all the different pieces work really well together.
Yeah.
You've got an advantage that when Microsoft updates one piece, they've already tested that it's not going to break other pieces. Right. Where, I'm sure you've had the experience when you have third-party tools, an update happens to, the main storage tool, and then, okay, we need to rush out an update for this other thing.
Right.
There's all sorts of challenges
This
there. Not
feature.
that won't happen, but
that feature you're using, it's no longer decided to be deprecated.
Right.
It's like, Jesus.
How do you think that the AI copilots and that functionality plays into this? Do you think that those types of tools are going to be so valuable that you sort of maybe would even give up some of the flexibility just to have it there so you can use those tools on it?
Well, it's actually a really good point. It's an interesting topic because, if Microsoft was not so heavily invested in OpenAI and ChatGPT wasn't so popular, then I might lean a little bit more towards the open source tools because you're going to have open source developers building things into those tools a little bit easier, and you're going to have the power of the developer community behind it. But with Microsoft, I think everything's going to, where we saw it at the build event, things are just going to be nice and cohesive, and it's going to be easy. So I think that being on Microsoft stuff and doing Fabric and being on Power BI and Azure is going to be a huge advantage in terms of productivity-based AI in some of this data fields.
I think that's right, and I'm sure they'll have interactivity with all of the Office tools, not just Excel, but PowerPoint, Word. It'll all come together.
Yeah,
I expect.
Sometimes it's those little things that are taken for granted, like how well those Microsoft things work together. You think about Fabric, which is where this Microsoft or the Power BI Copilot, at least in the demo, that's where that lived. And you get to take advantage of all the security groups and everything that you've already got to control your environment as part of Office 365, if that's what you're on, and you don't have to manage a separate thing. That's one of the kind of the pain points with other third-party tools like a Snowflake or like a DBT or something. There might be some integration, but it's just not the same as having a Microsoft tool that handles that for you.
Yeah, I mean, we're Microsoft Stack here, so we're biased, but we've always said we're open to moving to a better tool when it comes out, and Microsoft just keeps staying ahead of it. I mean, the investment in OpenAI was amazing. OpenAI seems to be, leading the pack, although, Meta, Google, everybody's coming along. But do those guys have the rest of the ecosystem where it really all comes together?
Right. Really for your, the productivity, for your workflow.
Yeah.
As a business user, it's just tough to beat.
I think that's right. It's a good point. So for the business user, it is tough to beat. If you're producing generative video or, I'm sure there's all sorts of medical applications and various things where there are definitely going to be people that aren't Microsoft that are coming out with the best in class software and tools. But if you're talking about business productivity, answering business questions and business BI and all of that stuff, it's going to be hard to bring in an outside tool that's going to work as well as the Microsoft tools on the Microsoft stack.
Right. Yeah. I think a good example of that is just I know it's a little off topic, but is Slack. Slack was a big deal for a while, and then Microsoft came out with Teams. And it was like, Teams is integrated with all my other stuff I already use, so I'm not going to do.
That's a great example because I actually liked Slack better than Teams. And I don't know if I do now because I've been using Teams now for years. It could be that Slack is still better than Teams.
Might be, yeah.
But Teams works with all the other tools so well that I'm not going to bother with it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about. I think you covered it nicely.
All right, good.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.